Welcome to CivilNet. My guest is Thomas de Waal. He specializes in the South Caucasus and he works at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Mr. de Waal, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
You're in Armenia to present a recent translation of your book that you're very well known for in the region and in Armenia, called Black Garden, Armenia and Azerbaijan Through Peace and War. You attended a discussion yesterday as well about the Karabakh conflict. And we have interviewed you many times before, always searching for answers to the questions that continue to present problems for us here in the region. Obviously, I want to talk to you about the conflict, the negotiation process. We talk about a frozen conflict, but really it has become a frozen peace process. And recent developments, the tensions on the border, the meeting in Sochi, and the latest Nato Summit, where Azerbaijani president and Serge Sarkisian, Armenia's president, met. So after that long introduction, what I want to know from you is, do you see any progress in the peace process at this point in time?
I don't really. I mean, I think your description of a frozen peace process is quite accurate. There are plenty of people who are willing to offer creative ideas, solutions, resources, but I think as we see from recent events, things are basically going in the wrong direction. I think this is in part a kind of spin-off from the Ukraine crisis. I think that has deepened frustration and cynicism in Azerbaijan about the peace process, a perception that Armenia is getting even closer to Russia. And of course, when there's frustration and cynicism in Azerbaijan, that has an impact also on Armenia, on the ceasefire and so on. And then we have this kind of vicious circle of incidents and then reactions. And then we saw this terrible little kind of small war in early August. So I'm afraid no progress. There are ideas. There's an idea that the Swiss presidency is putting forward of structured negotiations, which I think is.
But what does that mean, structured negotiations?
I think that's actually a very good point, because this is not really a peace process when the presidents basically have a monopoly over it. They're the ones who make the decisions, and yet they only meet very occasionally, only for a couple of hours. And you can't really get anything done with that.
And there's no public discourse in the respective societies about what it is that we do want at the end of the
exactly.
day.
The presidents control the message. They're incredibly cautious. I mean, they have their own political reasons to be cautious. This is not an issue you want to get wrong. And you change the status quo, you immediately get a backlash. But that caution also affects society, and there's a vicious circle in which nothing happens. And that also then the internationals look at this and say, well, we've got better things to be doing when there's other crises.
Bigger crises taking place.
To deal with. Yeah. So, idea of structured negotiations, I think, is a good one, which is that you, appoint people to deal with the issues, and you have a much broader discussion rather than just at the top. You have some experts, advisors dealing with it. So I think that's a good challenge to the two governments, to the two presidents, to say, if you're serious, then there's lots to talk about, and do it in a more structured way.
But would that be within the framework of the OSCE Minsk?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So it's not talking about removing that format, which is something that Azerbaijan has been lobbying for many years.
But I think, I mean, there's still a basic truth that mediators mediate, they don't resolve. They're the only people who resolve the conflict are Armenians and Azerbaijanis. The mediators can help, but they're not going to. We're not in the 19th century where the great powers impose a solution.
Well, indirectly, perhaps they impose their solution these days.
Obviously Russia has certain ideas, but I think even if Presidents Aliyev and Sarkisian really wanted to sit down together and decided they had a mutual interest in resolving the conflict, I don't think Russia would or could stop them.
Talking about Armenians and Azerbaijanis, obviously, I think today the societies are further apart than they were 20 years ago. We have a whole generation of Armenians and Azerbaijanis that have had absolutely no contact with one another. There is very little cross-border initiatives. A lot has to do, obviously, with the condition in the respective countries. There's, as you know, and you've written about this in recent years and months, there's a huge crackdown on human rights activists in Azerbaijan. We have difficulty finding partners if we were so inclined to do those kinds of initiatives. So how do we break this cycle? Is that part of the structured format that you?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and of course, that's very much up to the leaderships. Have to give the green light for these kind of initiatives, and as you said, things are going in the opposite direction. A couple of very well-respected people who I know are now sadly sitting in jail in Baku, accused of espionage for Armenia. All they did was come and have meetings, with non-governmental people in Yerevan. So it's got really bad. I mean, I think it's important to say that the kind of aggressive, very aggressive public rhetoric you see in Azerbaijan is not, it doesn't reflect the full picture. You talk to people in private, even some of the same people who say aggressive things in public, and they have a completely different discourse. So there's a kind of doublethink going on in Azerbaijan. Even quite official people can say, really want to get this solved, but they're waiting for a message from the top.
After the 1994 Russian brokered ceasefire, which we are celebrating or noting the 20th anniversary of, Azerbaijan was the loser, and in a 20-year period where there has been no progress, the rhetoric has increased, has become increasingly militaristic. Azerbaijan spends billions of dollars a year on on strengthening their army. Having said that, I want to also talk about oil and oil reserves, which fund, obviously, their ability to increase their military capacity or capability. Recently, Petrostrategies, which is a French think tank and consultancy firm, wrote that because of declining oil reserves in Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan will be forced by 2019-2020 to give a final solution to the Karabakh conflict. Now, whether that means full-out war, whether that means that in that period of time some kind of resolution or negotiation process had been successful. Does oil play a role also? And is that not of interest, strategic interest to Europe and the West?
It does. I mean, definitely the oil revenues are slowly declining, and as you say, on current projections, in around 6 or 7 years, they start to decline much more sharply. The plan in Azerbaijan is to compensate that with gas, but that and this new TAP pipeline being built, which around that time should start operating, supplying gas to southern Europe. But that's a much more, the profit margins in that project are much smaller. So that does mean that will come a moment, 5, 6, 7 years, when Azerbaijan has to make some strategic choices. Now, the bad scenario is that there's a kind of social backlash. Where did all the money go? That the government feels much more cornered and plays the Karabakh card to rally people around the flag, and that's when it gets dangerous. There is that scenario. There's also the scenario that the government decides, okay, now is the time that we've got to deal with the Karabakh question, because for our long-term strategic future, we basically only have one partner, that's Turkey, and we need to open the corridor, which means opening the borders with Armenia, work with the Armenians to resolve this. So there are those two scenarios.
And Turkey's role, obviously, is something that's important. Very recently, the president-elect, Erdogan, was in Baku, second official visit after his election, and said that Armenia-Turkey relations will never be resolved until the Karabakh issue is resolved. So there's also the Turkey factor in all of this as well. That's very important.
Well, I think Turkey is a lot more pragmatic. Turkey doesn't have a kind of big ideological interest. There's just, the influence of Azerbaijan, that they want to kind of a settlement of the Karabakh conflict that kind of honors and respects Azerbaijan. But I think they see that very differently from how the Azerbaijanis see it. And I think Turkey would massively benefit from a resolution of the conflict. They would also see this kind of communication east-west route open up, which would be, it would be of benefit for everybody. But of course, as we know in this region, it's hard to talk about long-term strategy. Everyone is thinking about, short-term politics, the past, the great national narrative, and so on.
Sure. Of course. Just as a final question, the NATO Summit in Wales, President Sarkisian and President Aliyev met on the sidelines of that with U.S. Secretary of State Kerry. There was a statement made about territorial integrity, sovereignty. Talk to me about that summit, and was it important in the larger scheme of what's going on in the South Caucasus?
Well, I think it was important in the sense, first of all, that President Sarkisian went. I think showed he has guts, that when his main strategic partner is Russia and Russia is in an open confrontation with NATO, that he goes to the NATO summit. I think that took some bravery. I think it shows that it was his signal that he still wants complementarity. Clearly he's much more in the Russian camp, but he doesn't want to close down his options with the West. I think that's a signal. We also know the armed forces in Armenia also have quite a good cooperation with NATO. And I think in return for that, he got the statement where, well, of course, the Azerbaijanis got the statement saying about territorial integrity, but there was a statement which put Armenia together with Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Moldova, and affirming the territorial integrity, independence, and sovereignty. And I think the word sovereignty was put in there for the Armenians, you know, that we recognize you're a sovereign state and we'll try and support you in your efforts to defend your sovereignty against kind of further Russian encroachment. So I think, you know, the Armenian president got something out of that.
And the Azerbaijanis got territorial integrity, which is...
Well, of course, it's all a bit confused. I mean, everyone, of course, as we know, the Minsk group tries to avoid using the word territorial integrity. They just talk about, you know, the six principles and the solution on the table. But I think this is a sign that, you know, both sides still want to kind of keep the Europeans and the Americans in there, although Russian influence is growing, and that they use their, you know, in the Caucasus they've been doing this for 500 years, playing the great powers off against each other in order to defend your own national interests.
Well, Mr. de Waal, thank you very much. It is indeed a very complex issue, one that requires political will and courage, perhaps, because when there is a thing called a negotiation process, there will have to be concessions made from both sides, presumably, for there to be a lasting peace. And hopefully it won't end up like a crisis in the Middle East, where we have an ongoing crisis that doesn't seem to want to resolve itself. So.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Thank you very
much.
I'd like to remind our viewers that my guest was Thomas de Waal of the Carnegie Foundation for International Peace from Washington, D.C. Stay with CivilNet.